A mother's dream of a perfect family was shattered by a secret so dark, it tore the heart of her home apart. The man she trusted, the man she married, had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. But when her daughter finally found the courage to speak, everything changed. This is the chilling true story of how one family's trust was shattered forever, and the heartbreaking journey to heal from a betrayal that no one saw coming. Janet had always dreamed of a perfect family. As a single mother, she had dedicated herself to raising her two children, Emily and Tyler, with love and care. Life hadn't always been easy after her divorce, but Janet had worked hard to provide for her kids. They had a cozy home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where families could grow and children could play outside without fear. Janet had done her best to make sure that Emily and Tyler felt safe and loved, even in the face of life's challenges. But everything changed when she met Mike. Mike seemed like the answer to Janet's prayers. He was kind, charismatic, and immediately formed a bond with Emily and Tyler. He had a way with people, always making them feel like they were the most important person in the room. For Janet, Mike's charm was a breath of fresh air. He didn't just love her, he showed an interest in her children, something that had been rare for her in past relationships. Janet felt like she could finally relax, like they were becoming a real family again. It didn't take long before Janet made the decision to marry Mike. The wedding was small but beautiful. The kids were overjoyed, and Mike was the perfect new father figure. He played games with Tyler, who was 10, and took Emily, who was 8, out for ice cream. The house seemed livelier, with laughter echoing through the rooms. For the first time in years, Janet felt like everything was falling into place. There was a sense of normalcy and happiness that she had longed for, and Mike seemed to fit seamlessly into their world. However, as much as Janet wanted to believe that their new life would be nothing but happiness, she couldn't completely ignore a feeling that lingered in the back of her mind. Mike's overzealous devotion to Emily and Tyler was admirable at first, after all. Who wouldn't want a father who was so involved with his children? But there was something about it that felt too perfect, too calculated. He always wanted to be with them, even when they were doing things that didn't require his attention. Janet thought little of it at first, after all. Mike was just trying to be a good stepdad. What Janet didn't realize was that Mike's attention was starting to take on a much darker edge. At first, the changes in Emily were subtle. She wasn't as talkative as she used to be. The once bubbly little girl who loved to tell stories about her day at school now sat quietly, her eyes downcast. Janet assumed it was just the growing pains of adjusting to a blended family. Emily had always been sensitive, so perhaps the transition was harder on her than she let on. But soon, other small changes started to surface that made Janet wonder if something deeper was going on. Emily started complaining about feeling sick on school mornings, her stomach often in knots. At first, Janet thought it was simply a case of nerves. Perhaps Emily was struggling with some of the changes in her life. But the pattern continued for weeks, and Janet began to wonder why Emily's symptoms always seemed to appear when it was time to leave the house. The girl who used to love school and her friends was now dreading it. Tyler, on the other hand, started to act out more. The once easygoing boy who was full of energy and creativity became unusually withdrawn, his mood shifting without explanation. He would get frustrated over small things, like not being able to find his favorite toy or a minor disagreement with his sister. Janet tried to chalk it up to typical sibling rivalry or the stress of their changing family dynamic, but Tyler's behavior felt different. There was an edge to his actions, as if he was afraid of something. It wasn't just the kids who were changing. Mike, too, started to act differently. At first, he had been the model partner, attentive, patient, and understanding. But now he seemed possessive, his patience thinning. He would become irritated when Emily wanted to spend time with friends instead of him, and he often tried to keep her home from school with vague excuses about needing her around the house. Janet dismissed it as protective behavior. Mike had never been a father before, and maybe he was just struggling with what it meant to be a stepdad. She tried to remind herself that blending families wasn't easy, and that Mike was just adjusting, like the rest of them. But as time passed, Janet began to feel the weight of her growing concerns. Mike's once affectionate gestures now felt strangely controlling. He would get too close to Emily when they were watching TV, or insist on helping her with homework, even when she didn't ask. He seemed to be always hovering around, keeping a constant watch over her. Tyler, who had always enjoyed spending time with his stepdad, began to pull away. He grew nervous around Mike, always glancing over his shoulder when he entered a room. Janet, distracted by the busyness of life, hadn't yet connected the dots. One evening, while tidying up after dinner, Janet found herself standing in the hallway, hearing Emily and Mike talking softly in the next room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling. It was a whisper, an intimacy that didn't feel right. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just her imagination running wild. But deep down, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And little did she know, the foundation of trust that she had worked so hard to build was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. The evening began like any other. Janet had just come home from a long day at work, exhausted but hopeful for a quiet night with her family. She greeted Emily and Tyler with a smile as they sat at the kitchen table, finishing their homework. Mike was in the living room, watching TV. The house felt like it was slowly returning to normal, but something in the air was different tonight. There was a heaviness, an unspoken tension that Janet couldn't pinpoint. As she began preparing dinner, she heard a soft knock on the door to the kitchen. It was Emily, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She stood there, trembling, her small frame frozen as if she had to summon every ounce of courage to speak. Janet's heart tightened at the sight of her daughter's distress. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she asked, kneeling down to meet Emily's gaze. I need to tell you something," Mom Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked over her shoulder nervously, as if she feared someone might overhear. Janet's concern grew. "Of course, Emily. What is it? You can tell me anything." Emily's hands shook as she clasped them together in front of her, struggling to find the words. "It's Mike," she finally said. The name sent a chill down Janet's spine. She tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "What about Mike?" Emily hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the courage to speak the truth she had been holding inside for so long. "He's been hurting me, Mom. I didn't know what to do. I thought I could make it stop, but I couldn't. I'm so sorry." The words hit Janet like a tidal wave, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of what her daughter had just confessed began to sink in. Emily's words were clear, but the shock of hearing them made it impossible to grasp the full weight of the truth. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. Janet felt the ground beneath her tremble as she tried to process what Emily had just said. She fought back the tears, struggling to maintain her composure. She reached out and pulled Emily into an embrace, whispering, "You're not alone. You did the right thing by telling me. We'll fix this together, I promise." Tears streamed down both of their faces as Emily clung to her mother, the weight of the secret finally released. Janet felt a wave of guilt wash over her. How had she not seen the signs? How had she allowed this to happen under her roof? But now was not the time for guilt, now was the time for action. Janet quickly called the authorities, her hands trembling as she dialed the number for help. As the police arrived and began their investigation, Emily was taken to a safe space, and Janet felt the shock of betrayal and heartbreak consume her. The man she had trusted, the man she had married, the man who had been her partner in creating this family, was not the person he had pretended to be. Janet could barely process it all. She had allowed him into her life, into the lives of her children, and he had shattered everything. The next few days were a blur of police visits, interviews, and emotional breakdowns. Janet could barely breathe, let alone think clearly. Her world had been turned upside down. As the police started their investigation, they uncovered a series of chilling details that confirmed her worst fears. Mike wasn't just a man who had made a terrible mistake. He was a predator. The authorities discovered that Mike had been grooming both Emily and Tyler for months, using his position in the family to manipulate them. He had subtly isolated Emily, convincing her to stay home from school, to spend more time with him, and to trust him above anyone else. He had used his authority as a father figure to control and confuse her, making her believe that she was the one at fault. Tyler, too, had been subjected to subtle manipulation, though not to the same extent. He had witnessed disturbing moments, things he didn't fully understand at the time, but in hindsight it all made sense. The eerie possessiveness, the unnecessary closeness, the way Mike had always insisted on being there when the children needed space, it all pointed to a pattern of abuse. The investigation revealed that Mike had a long history of similar behavior, but it had never come to light until now. Janet was horrified to learn that he had been arrested for similar offenses in previous relationships, but those charges had somehow been swept under the rug. He had been given a fresh start, a second chance with Janet and her children, and he had squandered it. The more the police uncovered, the more chilling the truth became. Mike had not only manipulated Emily and Tyler, but he had also managed to conceal his actions behind a mask of normalcy. He had kept up appearances, charmed their neighbors, and played the role of the perfect husband and stepfather. No one had suspected a thing. Mike was, in many ways, a master of deception. The pain of realizing how deep his lies had gone weighed heavily on Janet. She had trusted him, and he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. The investigation took weeks, and as the truth came to light, the community reacted with shock and disgust. Neighbors who had once praised Mike's kindness and generosity now realized that they had been duped. Janet felt the isolation creep in, as people began to distance themselves from her family. She couldn't blame them. How could anyone know what to say to someone whose world had just crumbled? The hardest part for Janet, however, was seeing the damage done to Emily and Tyler. They were both shattered, their trust in the world destroyed by the very person they had once called family. Janet struggled to find the right words of comfort, unsure how to help them heal. But she vowed to do whatever it took to protect her children and rebuild their lives, even if it meant confronting the darkest truths of the past. The arrest of Mike marked the beginning of a long, painful journey toward justice. For Janet, it was also the start of the hardest chapter of her life, rebuilding her family's trust, healing the wounds caused by betrayal, and learning how to move forward after everything had been shattered. But the one thing she knew for certain was this: she would never give up on her children. They had survived the worst, and together, they would find a way to rebuild. The arrest of Mike felt like a cruel exhale, the breath Janet had been holding for so long finally escaping her lungs, but with it came a torrent of emotions. The shock, the guilt, the anger, and the overwhelming sadness, all of it crashed over her, leaving her breathless. While the law would eventually determine Mike's fate, Janet knew that the true work, the healing, was just beginning for her family. No one emerged from a situation like this unscathed, and she wasn't sure how long it would take before the emotional wounds even began to close. But one thing was certain: Janet would not give up. She would not let her children suffer in silence. The days following Mike's arrest felt like a blur. The constant interviews with social workers and police investigators, the never-ending paperwork, the well-meaning but awkward calls from friends and relatives who didn't quite know what to say, all of it weighed heavily on Janet. But what hurt the most was seeing Emily and Tyler, her children, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become their lives. They were not just dealing with the trauma of betrayal, but also with the sense of shame that comes with being violated by someone they had trusted so implicitly. Emily was the first to retreat. Her usual spunk and vibrancy were replaced by a quiet emptiness. She no longer wanted to go outside or talk to her friends. She spent hours in her room, staring out the window, lost in thoughts that Janet could never fully understand. Janet would try to talk to her, sitting on the edge of her bed, her heart breaking with each distant look Emily gave her. But Emily's pain was locked deep inside, and no matter how many times Janet told her she was safe now, that Mike could never hurt her again, it didn't seem to matter. The emotional scars ran too deep. Tyler, who had always been more outwardly expressive, was harder to read. He was angry at Mike, angry at the world, angry at himself. His frustration often turned into bursts of rage, smashing toys, slamming doors, and shouting at the top of his lungs. Janet tried to be patient with him, knowing that his anger came from a place of fear and confusion. He'd been forced to grow up too fast, to witness things no child should ever have to see. And yet, despite his outward anger, Tyler often cried in private, his tears unseen as he struggled to understand the trauma he'd experienced. Janet, too, struggled. The guilt she felt for not seeing the signs sooner was like a constant weight on her chest. How had she missed it? How had Mike been able to manipulate her and her children so thoroughly? Every time she thought about it, her stomach twisted in knots. She had trusted him. She had believed in him, let him into her children's lives, and now she had to face the consequences of that misplaced trust. The overwhelming responsibility of healing her family and protecting her children from any further harm became her sole focus, but at times the task felt impossible. To add to the emotional chaos, the community's reaction was swift. Neighbors who had once been friendly waved awkwardly from across the street, their smiles stiff and strained. A few even outright avoided Janet, as if somehow her connection to Mike's crimes tainted her too. Janet knew that many of them had no idea what it felt like to be betrayed in such an intimate and destructive way. Still, their avoidance made her feel even more isolated. There were days when she wanted to scream in frustration, to run away from the small town where she had once felt safe, where she had believed in the security of home and family. But running away wouldn't help her children. It wouldn't help her heal. The hardest part, though, was seeing how Emily and Tyler had changed. Emily, once so full of light, was now a shadow of herself. Janet tried everything she could think of to help her daughter, from gentle conversations to encouraging her to reconnect with her friends, but nothing seemed to work. Emily had been so close to Mike, and the betrayal cut deeper than Janet could have imagined. She started attending therapy, as did Tyler, though both children struggled to open up. Their therapist was patient, but Janet knew it would take time. She just hoped that, with time, her children would find their way back to themselves. Tyler's anger was more visible, more immediate. He'd lash out at Emily, at Janet, at the world. He seemed to want to control everything around him, but nothing seemed to calm his nerves or ease his pain. Janet had to remind herself that this was a response to trauma. Tyler was lost, and so was Emily. The sadness that consumed them both was all-consuming. It hurt Janet to see her children so broken, but it also gave her the strength to keep pushing forward. For them. For the future. In the midst of all this turmoil, Janet had to find a way to rebuild her life. She sought counseling for herself as well, knowing that healing didn't just happen through helping her children. She needed to come to terms with what had happened, to make sense of her own feelings of betrayal, guilt, and anger. Slowly, she started to find the pieces of herself that had been lost in the chaos. But the truth was, she couldn't do it alone. She needed support, and though her friends and family had withdrawn, she found solace in online communities where women shared similar experiences. Her therapist, too, was a rock during this time, helping Janet untangle the web of emotions she was drowning in. Janet didn't know how long it would take to heal. She didn't know when or if her children would ever return to their old selves. But she had one promise she could hold on to: they would heal together. Slowly but surely they would move forward. The scars would never fully fade, but with time the pain would become more bearable. Janet found strength in knowing that, as a mother, she would do everything in her power to protect her children from harm, no matter how long it took. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and difficult conversations. But Janet was no longer just a victim of betrayal. She was a mother, determined to rebuild her family and restore what had been broken. In the face of unimaginable pain, she found the courage to keep going, because she knew that, together, they could overcome anything.